Hey guys. Tonight, we're stepping softly into a warm kitchen just before evening, back when the light came in gold and low through the window over the sink, and the whole house smelled of a roast that had been in the oven since early afternoon. Somewhere a radio plays low, a screen door taps gently against its frame, and a table is being set with the good dishes, the ones kept behind glass all year and brought out only when company is coming. Before we settle in, I want to say a warm and genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You send me the kindest, most thoughtful ideas, and honestly, this little channel grows because of you and the notes you leave behind. If you are enjoying these quiet trips back in time, it would mean a great deal if you would like the video, subscribe, and maybe leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what the evening is like where you are. No pressure at all, and if you ever want to carry these stories along on a walk or a long drive, the channel is now on Spotify too, with the link waiting for you down in the description. Now go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft, steady hum. Pull the blanket up, find the cool side of the pillow, and let the day loosen its grip on your shoulders. And as you settle, let yourself wonder a little. What did it actually feel like to be invited to someone's home for dinner in 1955? What did you wear, and how early did you start getting ready? What did you carry up the front walk in your hands? How did you know which fork to reach for, and when you were finally allowed to begin? What did people talk about around the table, and what did they carefully leave unsaid? And just like that, it is a Friday evening in 1955. The porch light is on. A car door closes somewhere down the block. And you are standing on a welcome mat with something wrapped gently in your hands, about to knock on a door that opens into a whole evening of quiet, unspoken rules. It begins days before you ever set foot on the porch. Maybe it came as a telephone call on a Tuesday evening, your neighbour's voice bright on the line, asking if you and yours might come for dinner that Friday. Or maybe it arrived as a small note in the mail, the handwriting careful, the paper faintly scented with the drawer it had been kept in. Either way, the invitation was a gift in itself, and it carried quiet expectations. You were expected to answer promptly, warmly, and clearly, so the hostess could plan her table down to the very last chair. In a world without a screen to tap, a simple reply was a small act of respect. And so the evening truly begins here, at the little telephone table in the hall, or at the kitchen counter where the note lies open beside the sugar bowl. You read it again, and you feel that small flutter of being wanted, of being counted among the people someone hoped to gather close. An invitation then was not a casual thing tossed off between other tasks. It was chosen. It meant that a woman somewhere across town had thought of your face and decided her table would be better with you at it. You answered without letting the days slip by. To leave a hostess waiting, unsure whether to set 5 places or 7, was simply not done. So you called her back that same evening, or posted your reply the very next morning, and you said yes with real warmth in your voice. If you had to say no, you said it kindly and soon, with a reason offered and regret that sounded like you meant it. For her, the planning began the moment your yes arrived. She thought of the roast she would order from the butcher, the vegetables she would put up, the dessert she would start the night before so it had time to set. She counted her chairs. She checked whether the good tablecloth needed pressing, and whether there were enough matching napkins folded away. Your single word set all of that quietly into motion, like the first push of a swing. And there was a rhythm to it that feels almost forgotten. The waiting was part of the pleasure. You had time to look forward to the evening, to let it sit warmly at the edge of your ordinary days. Wednesday and Thursday passed with the dinner glowing softly ahead of you, a bright point on the calendar. You did not have every moment filled and rearranged. You simply held the plan gently and let the anticipation build, the way a child holds the days before a birthday. Your neighbour down the street felt it too, already fussing in the happiest way over what she would serve and how the table would look. She wanted you to walk into her home and feel, right away, that she had taken care, that this evening was meant to be something set apart from the plain run of the week. That was the whole heart of it, really. An invitation was one neighbour saying to another, "Come, sit at my table. Let me feed you and welcome you, and make you feel that you belong." So you set the note back on the counter, and the evening is already alive in your mind. It is not Friday yet, but it has begun all the same, and there is something worth holding on to in that, a reminder that the finest evenings were never rushed into being. They were promised and prepared and waited for, with care on both ends of the line. It is 1:15 now, and you find yourself doing something that might seem strange today. You are waiting. Perhaps you're sitting in the car at the end of the block, watching the porch light glow, letting the minutes pass. Because in 1955, arriving early was nearly as thoughtless as arriving late. The hostess needed those final minutes to catch her breath, to check the oven one last time, to smooth her apron and slip it away out of sight. So you wait until the hands of your watch line up just right, and only then do you start up the front walk. There is a courtesy in that patience that is easy to forget now. You know exactly what is happening inside that house. You can picture it as clearly as if the walls were glass. Your hostess is moving quickly through her kitchen in these last few minutes, giving the gravy one more stir, fixing her hair in the hallway mirror, untying her apron and folding it away so that when she opens the door, she will look as though the whole beautiful evening simply appeared around her without any effort at all. To arrive early would be to catch her mid-flight, and there was a kindness in refusing to do that. It would mean standing at the door while she scrambled, still flushed, made her feel that she was not ready when she wanted so badly to be. So you spared her that. You gave her those last precious minutes as a quiet gift, unseen and unthanked. But you would not be late either. A roast timed for the hour does not wait for a guest who dawdles. A hostess who has planned every dish to be ready at once watches the clock with rising worry as the minutes tick past, wondering whether to hold the meal or let it dry in the oven. So you aimed for that narrow, perfect window, arriving right as the hands met the hour. There is a whole vanished art in that kind of timing. People plan their leaving home around it. If you found yourself with minutes to spare, you simply waited, at the corner, in the car with the radio low, circling the block once more if you had to. Nobody thought it odd. The hour on the invitation meant the hour, and a considerate guest arranged himself around it. Think how different that feels from the way we come and go now, drifting in whenever the moment suits us, treating the agreed-upon time as a loose suggestion. There was a firmness to the old way, but also a great deal of respect folded inside it. To arrive on time was to say, without a single word, that you honoured the trouble your hostess had gone to, and then the clock catches up to you. The minute hand climbs to its place, and something in you settles. You gather your gift, step out of the car and close the door with a soft click, mindful even of the noise. You start up the front walk with an unhurried step, taking in the swept porch and the little pot of flowers by the door, all the small signs of a home made ready for company. There is a dignity in arriving this way, composed and expected and right on time. It is such a small thing, this matter of minutes, and yet it carried so much care inside it. In a world that moves faster than it once did, there is something worth remembering in the quiet grace of simply being on time, and in the patience it took to get there. Look down at your hands for a moment. There is something in them. Perhaps a bouquet gathered from your own garden and wrapped in damp newspaper. Perhaps a tin of cookies still warm from your kitchen, or a small box of chocolates tied with string. You did not arrive empty-handed because good guests never did. The gift was never grand, never meant to outshine the evening, only to say thank you before a single word was spoken. You would hand it over at the door with a little shyness, and your hostess would exclaim over it as though it were the finest thing she'd ever received. The choosing of it had begun earlier in the week, once your yes was given. You thought about what your hostess might like, what would please without putting her to any trouble, and you understood, in the quiet way everyone understood such things then, that the gift was meant to be modest. It was a gesture, not a display. To arrive with something lavish would embarrass her, would seem to ask for thanks rather than to give it. If it was flowers, you might have cut them from your own beds that afternoon. The last of the summer roses or a handful of zinnias, their stems wrapped in wet newspaper to keep them fresh for the drive. There was something especially tender in flowers you had grown yourself, in offering a little piece of your own garden to brighten someone else's table. If it was something from your kitchen, you had spent part of the day at it. A tin of cookies, still faintly warm, a loaf of bread wrapped in a clean cloth, a jar of preserves you had put up in the summer, the fruit glowing like a jewel through the glass. These were gifts made of your own time and effort, and everyone knew it, and that was exactly what made them precious. And if you bought something, you kept it simple and sweet, a small box of chocolates, a tin of good tea, and tied it with a bit of ribbon, because a gift ought to look like a gift. None of it cost a great deal. That was never the point. The point was the thought, carried in your two hands up the front steps. When the door opened, you offered it almost bashfully. You did not thrust it forward or make a great announcement of it. You simply held it out and said you had brought a little something, that you hoped she might like it, and your hostess, no matter what it was, took it up as though you had handed her the crown jewels, burying her face in the flowers, hurrying to find a vase, saying she could not wait to try a cookie with her coffee. That was her part in the dance, and she played it beautifully. She knew, just as you did, that the gift was never really about the thing itself. It was about the exchange of warmth, the little ceremony of giving and receiving that opened the door of her home a little wider. We have grown a little casual about all of this now, turning up to one another's homes with our hands in our pockets more often than not, meaning no harm by it. But there was a grace in the old way. As your hostess cradles your small gift and ushers you inside, you understand that the evening has already begun on exactly the right note, the note of gratitude, offered gently and received with joy. Let's go back a few hours to your own bedroom mirror. Getting dressed for dinner was not a small thing. You pressed your good shirt or slipped into your best day dress, the one saved for church and company. The men wore jackets and ties even in the summer heat, and the women drew on white gloves and pinned their hair with care. You checked your shoes twice. You wore a little perfume or a splash of aftershave. To dress carefully was to honour your host, a quiet way of saying this evening matters to me, and so do you. It is a kind of effort we rarely make for one another anymore. The preparation had its own quiet ceremony. You did not simply pull on whatever lay closest to hand. You went to the closet and chose deliberately the clothes you kept for occasions that counted. A woman inspected her good dress in the light of the window for any spot or wrinkle, pressed it if it needed pressing, the iron hissing softly, the smell of warm cotton filling the room. A man took out the good jacket, the pressed trousers, a clean white shirt and a tie chosen to go with it, even when the evening promised to be warm. There was no notion then of dressing down for a friend. If anything, the closer the friendship, the more you wanted to show you had made an effort. You wanted to walk into their home looking as though the evening deserved your care, because it did. To arrive rumpled or careless would have suggested that you thought little of them. For the women, there was the small ritual of the gloves, drawn on smooth and white, and the careful setting of the hair. Perhaps a dab of lipstick, a single string of pearls, perfume behind the ears, chosen with care and never too heavy. For the men, a close shave, the face patted with aftershave that stung pleasantly, the hair combed back, and above all the shoes checked and shined, for a man's shoes were said to tell the whole story of his care for himself. And there was pleasure in it, real pleasure, in the getting ready. Dressing for an evening was part of the evening. It marked the shift from the ordinary day into something finer. You felt different in your good clothes, a little more upright, a little more your best self. Putting them on was like stepping into the role the evening asked of you, the role of the welcome guest, poised and gracious and glad to be there. Think of how much of that has slipped away. We move through so much of our lives now in soft, easy clothes, the same things we might wear to lounge at home, worn out into the world without a second thought. There is a comfort in that, and no one would wish to give it up entirely, but something was lost when we stopped dressing for one another. The effort itself was a language. It said, without a word, that the person you were going to see was worth the trouble of your best. Your hostess, on the other end of the evening, was dressing with the same care, and she would notice yours. Her home had been made ready with love, and here you came, made ready to match it. There was a lovely symmetry in that. So you take one last look in the mirror. The tie is straight, the shoes gleam softly. You look rather nice, and you feel it too. That small lift of standing in your good clothes with somewhere fine to go. And as you turn from the mirror and reach for your coat, you carry that care with you, worn as plainly and as proudly as the clothes on your back. Now you are on the porch, and you knock. The door swings open, and there is your host, framed in warm yellow light, already reaching out a hand. There are smiles, a clasp of the hand for the men, a light touch on the arm for the ladies. The smell of dinner drifts out to meet you. Behind your host you can hear the murmur of other voices, the soft clink of ice in glasses. You wipe your feet on the mat without being asked. This first moment set the tone for the entire night, and everyone knew their small part in it by heart. There is a whole world contained in that opening of the door. For a breath, before it swings wide, you stand on the threshold in the cool evening air, gift in hand, and then the latch turns and the house spills its warmth out onto the porch to greet you. Light and sound and the smell of good cooking come rushing forward all at once, and there in the middle of it stands your host, his face breaking into a smile at the sight of you. The greeting had its own gentle shape, known to all. For the men, a handshake, firm and warm, one hand sometimes reaching to clasp the shoulder as well. For the women, a lighter touch, a hand on the arm, a clasp of both hands. Words came easily and warmly. So glad you could come. Coming out of the cold. Don't you look wonderful? The welcome was not a formality to be gotten through, but a real pleasure taken in one another's arrival. You wiped your feet, of course, without being told because it was second nature. You would not track the day's dust across a floor that had plainly been swept and waxed for company. It was a small courtesy, that pause on the mat, but it was part of the language of being a guest. And even in that first moment, the roles were understood by everyone. Your host welcomed. You responded with warmth and thanks. The gift was offered and received. Behind it all, the murmur of guests already arrived told you the evening was underway, that a little society had gathered in the rooms beyond, waiting to fold you into its number. There was such reassurance in the predictability of it. You knew, walking up to any door in the neighbourhood, how you would be received, and the two of you moved through the small opening ceremony smoothly because you had both learned the steps long ago. Nobody had to wonder what to do with their hands. The customs held everyone gently in place, and there was freedom in that, the freedom of knowing exactly how to be. The senses were full in that doorway. The golden light of the front hall, so different from the cool blue dusk you'd come out of. The smell of the roast wrapping around you and drawing you in. The sound of voices and glasses, perhaps a record turning low. It was a great deal to take in at once, and it announced, unmistakably, that you had arrived somewhere warm and welcoming, somewhere you were wanted. So you step across the threshold at last, your feet wiped, your gift offered, your host's warm words still in your ears. The door closes softly behind you, shutting out the evening chill, and you are inside now, wrapped in light and warmth and the good smell of dinner. The whole night lies ahead, but its tone has already been set here, in these first warm moments at the door, and you feel it settle into you, that simple, human happiness of being glad to see and glad to be seen. Just inside the door, there's a small dance you both know well. Your host reaches to take your coat, and you let it slide from your shoulders into waiting hands. Perhaps it is carried off to a back bedroom and laid across the bed with all the others, a soft growing pile of wool and gabardine. The front hall smells of floor wax and the roast waiting beyond it. You lower your voice a little, the way people do when they cross a threshold into someone else's world. You're a guest now, and the house folds gently around you. The taking of the coat was a courtesy your host would not have dreamed of skipping, and one you accepted with a small murmur of thanks. He came around behind you, or your hostess did, and helped ease the coat from your shoulders, catching it as it slipped free. There was a gentle attentiveness in the gesture, a way of relieving you of your burdens the moment you arrived. You did not shrug out of your own coat and look about for a hook. You let yourself be helped, because being helped was part of being welcomed. And then the coat was carried away to the back bedroom where it joined the others across the bed. There is something lovely in that image, the growing heap of coats, each one belonging to someone gathered here tonight, all resting together in the quiet of a darkened room, while their owners talked and laughed elsewhere in the house. The front hall itself told you something about the home. The smell of floor wax, clean and faintly sweet, spoke of a house cared for, polished, made ready. Beneath it wound the deeper smell of the dinner, drifting from the kitchen to fill the hole downstairs with the promise of the meal to come. And you found, as you stepped fully inside, that your own manner shifted a little. Your voice came down. You moved more carefully. There is an old and deep instinct in us to soften ourselves when we enter another person's home, to become a touch more gentle, more considerate. You were no longer in your own space where you could be loud and careless. You were in someone else's world now, a world they had shaped and cared for, and you honoured that by adjusting yourself to it. It was not stiffness, this softening, and it did not make you less at ease. If anything, there was a great comfort in it, in knowing how to be a good guest, in letting the customs of the house guide you. The knowing freed you to simply enjoy yourself. People used to say a guest should make himself at home, and it was meant kindly, but everyone understood it did not mean quite what the words said. You did not truly treat the house as your own, putting your feet up, helping yourself to whatever you pleased. You made yourself at home in the sense of being at ease, being warm and glad to be there, while never forgetting that this was a kindness extended to you. Think of how casually we often enter one another's homes now, tossing a coat over a chair, moving through the space as though it were an extension of our own. There is a friendliness in that. But something gracious was carried in the old way. So your coat is spirited away, and you stand now in the warm front hall, unburdened, your voice soft, the smell of the roast drawing you gently forward. Your host gestures toward the living room, and you go where you are led. The house folds around you like a warm hand, and there is nowhere in the world just now that you would rather be. It is not time to eat yet. First comes the gathering in the living room, that unhurried stretch of the evening when the grown-ups stand and sit and talk. Perhaps your host offers a drink, a highball or a small glass of sherry, poured with a little ceremony from a cart in the corner. You hold your glass and you mingle. There is no rushing to the table, no glancing at the time. The evening was meant to unfold slowly, one warm layer at a time. It is the kind of patient, in-between hour that feels almost impossible to find in an evening now. This hour before the meal had a purpose, and it was cherished. It was the time for settling in, for letting the day fall away, for easing into the company of the people around you before a single dish was served. Nobody hurried it. The dinner would come when it came, and until then there was nothing to do but stand about in the warm lamplight with a glass in your hand. The drinks cart was a small stage of its own, gleaming in the corner of the living room. Bottles caught the light, and the ice waited in its bucket, and your host approached it with the pleasant seriousness of a man who took his duties as a host to heart. There was little ceremony in the pouring and the stirring and the handing over. The drink was not the point of the hour, only its gentle accompaniment, something to hold and sip while the talk went round. And the talk did go round, easily and without any particular aim. This was not the time for weighty matters. It was the time for the pleasant surface of things, for asking after one another, for the small warm exchanges that knit a group of people together. You moved from one cluster to another, glass in hand, learning who else had come, catching up on the ordinary news of the neighbourhood. What strikes you most, looking back, is the slowness of it. There was no clock ruling over the evening, no restlessness pulling anyone toward the next moment. The hour was allowed to be exactly as long as it needed to be. People sat when they wished, and stood when they wished. Beneath it all lay a deep, easy patience, a shared understanding that the evening was not a thing to be rushed through, but a thing to be savoured, layer by unhurried layer. We've grown so unused to that kind of time. Our evenings are so often crowded and quick, one thing hurrying into the next, the temptation always there to check the time or reach for something in a pocket. The idea of a whole spacious hour given over to nothing but talking and sipping a drink, with no aim and no hurry, can feel almost extravagant now. But there was such richness in it. That slow hour was where the real warmth of the evening was made. It was where the stiffness of arrival melted into ease, where friendships were tended in 100 small, unremarkable exchanges. By the time dinner was announced, you were no longer a collection of guests who had merely turned up at the same house. You had become, over that golden hour, a gathering, and the room held it all so beautifully. the lamplight warm and low, softening every face, the murmur of voices rising and falling, the clink of ice in glasses, the good smell of dinner growing stronger from the kitchen. You stood in the middle of it and felt the week's cares loosen and drift away, felt the simple pleasure of being among people who were glad to have you. This slow golden hour before dinner was the first and perhaps the finest layer of the whole evening. Someone new steps into the room, and here the quiet rules take over. There was a proper way to introduce people. The younger presented to the older, the gentleman to the lady, always with a clear name and a kind word. You offered your hand, you met the person's eyes, you remembered to smile. And then came the small talk, that gentle craft of asking after someone's family, their garden, their work, never prying too far. Conversation was something you tended like a fire, feeding it slowly, careful never to let it go cold or blaze too hot. The introduction itself was a small and graceful thing, done with care because it mattered how people were brought together. Your host or hostess did the honours, speaking each name clearly so that neither stranger would have to strain to catch it. And there was an order to it. Older than anyone in the room, the younger presented to the older, the gentleman to the lady, a way of showing respect through the very shape of the introduction. Most people no longer thought about it consciously. It simply lived in them, learned so long ago it had become instinct. When your turn came, you offered your hand and gave it a firm but gentle press. You looked the other person in the eye warmly, and you said something kind and simple, and importantly you held on to the name. To catch a name and use it in your first words was a small gift, a way of telling them they mattered enough to be remembered. And then began the small talk, which was not small at all, not really. It only wore a modest name. You asked after the safe and pleasant things. How was their family? Whether their garden had done well? How they were finding their work? You listened to the answers and you offered your own in turn, and slowly a small warmth kindled. There was real skill in it, in knowing what to ask and what to leave alone. You did not pry. You did not press into tender places, into money or trouble or matters too private for a first meeting. If they steered away from something, you followed without a flicker, turning the talk gently elsewhere. The aim was ease, comfort, the pleasant sense of being drawn kindly into company. The image of tending a fire is just right for it. A conversation needed feeding, small offerings of interest and warmth, laid on gently so it might catch and grow. But it could be smothered too, by a person who talked only of himself, or who pressed too hard, or who let a silence stretch until it grew cold, and it was understood to be a duty, especially the duty of the one more at ease to look after the one less so. If you saw someone standing alone at the edge of the room, uncertain, you went to them. You drew them in. It would have been a small cruelty to leave a fellow guest stranded and silent, and a good guest simply did not do it. How different it can feel now, when so many of us have grown a little shy of these small graces, quick to reach for a screen when a silence falls. The old small talk could seem, from a distance, like empty chatter. But it was the very mortar of a sociable evening, the humble work by which strangers became friends. It asked you to be genuinely interested in other people, and to take a little trouble over their comfort, and there was a quiet generosity in that. So you stand in the lamplit room, glass in hand, and you tend the small flames of conversation all around you. You catch the new arrival's name and say it warmly. You draw in the quiet one at the edge of the group, and slowly the room grows warmer and easier, and the evening knits itself together. one gentle exchange at a time. Then from the doorway your hostess appears and speaks the words everyone has been waiting for. Dinner is ready. There's a soft shift in the room. Glasses set down, sentences finished. A general drifting toward the dining room. You do not race ahead. You let the older guests go first, and you let your hostess lead the way. The dining room glows ahead of you, candles lit, the good china catching the light. There is a small thrill in that moment, the quiet ceremony of moving as a group from one room to the next, that we have almost entirely lost. The announcement itself was a small performance, and your hostess had timed it with care. She had slipped away some minutes before, back to her kitchen, to see the last of the dinner brought together, and now she reappeared in the doorway with a certain glow about her, the glow of a woman whose great labour is about to be revealed. She spoke simply, warmly, the words that turned the whole evening on its hinge. There was a lovely softness to the shift. Conversations were brought gently to their close rather than cut off. A last sip was taken, a glass set down. People rose, unhurried, still talking, and began to drift as one toward the dining room. Nobody bolted for the table as though afraid the food might vanish. That would have been unthinkable, a little greedy. Instead, the whole company moved together in a slow and pleasant current, and in that movement the old courtesies showed themselves again. You did not push to the front. You held back, and you let the older guests go before you, and you let your hostess lead the way to the room she'd made ready. There was deference in it, a natural yielding of place, and no resentment in the yielding. It was simply how things were done. The dining room, when it opened before you, was a small revelation. All evening it had waited behind its door, and now it stood revealed in its full glory. The candles were lit, their little flames swaying, casting a soft and flattering light. The good china gleamed. The silver caught the candlelight and threw it back in points of brightness. The tablecloth lay crisp and white, and perhaps there were flowers at the centre. It was a picture, a composition, made with love and set out to be admired. That first sight of the table was meant to draw a small breath of pleasure from you, and it did. A murmur went round, appreciative and sincere how lovely everything looked. And your hostess received it with quiet pleasure, because the beauty of the table was part of the gift she was giving. There is a word for what that movement from one room to the next truly was, and the word is ceremony. It was a marking of the passage from the loose, standing hour of drinks into the ordered, seated hour of the meal. The change of rooms was the change of chapters, and everyone felt the evening gather itself and rise. We have let so much of that slip away. So often now a meal simply happens, food carried to wherever people already sit, no threshold crossed, no procession. It is easier, and there is nothing wrong with easy. But the old way held a magic that ease cannot quite replace, the anticipation building and then the door opening onto the glowing table. So you set down your glass, finish your sentence, and fall into the slow current moving toward the dining room. You hold back, let the elders pass, and follow your hostess as she leads the way. And when the door opens and the candlelit table stands revealed before you, you feel that small thrill rise in your chest, and together, as one, you cross the threshold. Now comes a moment of quiet order. You do not simply drop into the nearest chair. Perhaps there are place cards, small folded tents of paper with names inked in a careful hand. The hostess directs you gently, mindful of who should sit beside whom. And then the men perform a small kindness that was second nature back then, drawing out the chairs for the ladies, easing them in before taking their own seats. It was a choreography everyone knew, unspoken and smooth. There is a tenderness in that old habit that lingers in the memory long after the meal is forgotten. The seating was never left to chance, and never to the scramble of everyone grabbing whatever chair they liked. Your hostess had thought about it, sometimes for days. She had turned over in her mind who would sit well beside whom, which guests would spark a lively talk, and which might sit awkwardly together. It was a quiet strategy, invisible to most, and one of the truest marks of a thoughtful hostess. Where she placed you said that she had considered you. If there were place cards, they made her wishes plain, those little folded tents standing at each setting. You walked slowly round the table, reading them, finding your own, and there was a small warmth in seeing your name written out and set at its appointed place. If there were no cards, your hostess directed you herself, with a light hand and a word. Either way, you waited to be placed. You did not presume. And then came the small courtesy that lingers so tenderly in the memory, the drawing out of the chairs. As the ladies came to their places, the men stepped behind them and eased the chairs back, then gently in, settling each lady before taking their own seats. It was done without fuss and without a word, so habitually that it hardly seemed a thing done at all. There is a temptation, from where we stand now, to see such gestures as quaint, or belonging to a world whose ideas about men and women we've moved beyond in many ways, and it is true that the world has changed, and changed in much that is good. But it would be a shame to let that blind us to the simple tenderness inside the old gesture, to see to another person's comfort before your own, to perform a small act of care as a matter of course, is a gentle and human thing. And the seating once accomplished, settled the whole table into its shape for the evening. Everyone found the place chosen for them, and in finding it, found also the neighbours they would talk with. Your hostess's careful planning came quietly to life. The lively guest sat beside the shy one and drew her out. The table arranged itself into a balanced and pleasant whole, and few of the guests ever knew how much thought had gone into it. There was comfort, too, in not having to decide. You were spared the small anxiety of the open room, the wondering where to sit, the awkward hovering while everyone waited for someone else to choose first. The order took all of that away, and there was ease in being held by it. We so often let the seating fall as it may now, everyone dropping in where they please, and there is a friendly informality in that. But something is lost when no one has thought about who sits by whom, when the shy guest ends up stranded and the table never quite finds its balance. So you find your place, whether by the inked card or your hostess's gentle word, and you stand behind your chair a moment. The table fills, quietly and in order, each guest in the place chosen with care, and as you settle in, neighbours to left and right, the candles glowing before you, you feel the evening take its final shape, and you understand that even the simple matter of where to sit was, in that gracious world, an act of thoughtfulness and care. Look down at your place setting. There, folded beside your plate or resting neatly upon it, is your napkin. But you do not touch it yet. You wait, your eyes on your hostess until she lifts hers and settles it across her lap. Only then do you follow, unfolding yours halfway and laying it gently over your knees. It seems like such a small thing, this bit of folded linen, and yet it opened the meal like a curtain rising. Everything at that table happened in its proper order, and the napkin was the first soft note of the evening's music. The napkin itself was a thing of quiet quality. Not paper, never paper, not on an evening such as this. It was linen or damask, laundered and starched and pressed until it held a crease as crisp as a folded letter, and it had been arranged at your place with the same care given to everything else on that table. And yet, for all its readiness, you left it alone until the signal came. This was the first of the table's many small rules of waiting, and it taught you at once the temper of the meal to come. Nothing here was to be rushed. You sat with your hands in your lap and you watched, without seeming to watch, for your hostess to make the first move. She was the conductor of this small orchestra, and the meal would not begin until she raised her hand. When she did, it was done so gently you might have missed it. She simply lifted her napkin, gave it a small shake to loosen its folds, and laid it across her lap. That small motion was the raising of the curtain. The signal passed silently round the table, and you followed, and every other guest followed, a soft rustle of linen going round as the napkins came off the table and settled onto laps. There was a right way even to unfold it. You did not snap it open with a flourish, as though shaking out a bedsheet. You unfolded it discreetly, only halfway if it was a large dinner napkin, and laid it folded across your knees. It stayed there for the whole of the meal, brought up now and then to touch lightly at the corner of your mouth, always blotted rather than scrubbed, always returned at once to your lap. Small as it was, the napkin carried real meaning in its movements. Placed on your lap, it said the meal was underway. Later, set to the left of your plate, it would say you had risen only for a moment. Laid gently beside your plate at the very end, loosely, never crumpled into a ball, it would say the meal was done. The whole evening could be read, if you knew how, in the quiet language of a folded cloth. It strikes you how much has been lost in our turn toward the disposable. We reach for a paper napkin without a thought, use it and throw it away, and there is no ceremony in it at all. The cloth napkin asks something of you. It asked you to wait, to watch, to handle it with care, to make it part of the small grammar of the table. And in asking those things, it slowed you down and drew you into the shared rhythm of the meal. That was really the heart of it, the shared rhythm. Before the napkin, you were a collection of people who had merely sat down at the same table. After it, with every napkin laid across every lap in the same soft moment, you had become a company at dinner, moving together, beginning together. So you sit, hands quiet, eyes on your hostess, and you wait. The candles sway. Then she lifts her napkin and lays it across her lap, and all around the table the soft rustle answers her. You take up your own, unfold it halfway, and settle it over your knees, and in that small motion you join the meal at last. Such a little thing, and yet it holds the whole spirit of that gracious table, where nothing was rushed and even the simplest cloth was handled with quiet care. Before a single fork is lifted, there is a hush. In many homes, the head of the table would ask everyone to bow their heads, and a blessing would be spoken over the food and the company gathered around it. Hands might be folded, or reach quietly for the hands beside them. It was a brief moment, sometimes only a sentence or two, but it drew the whole table together into a single breath. Whatever you believed in your own heart, you honoured the custom of the house. That pause of gratitude before the plates were even touched gave the meal a weight that feels rare at our tables now. The hush came all at once, and everyone felt it settle. The talk that had carried you to the table faded away. Glasses were set down. And into that quiet, the head of the household spoke, or asked another to speak, the few words of grace that marked the true beginning of the meal. The words themselves were often simple and familiar, worn smooth by long use, the same grace spoken over that table night after night. There was no need for eloquence. The blessing gave thanks for the food, for the hands that had prepared it, for the company gathered to share it. It asked little and offered much, and it was over almost before it had begun, but it left its mark on the meal all the same. Around the table hands found their places. Some folded their own, heads bowed, eyes closed. In some homes, especially among family and close friends, hands reached out to the hands on either side, and the whole table was joined in a ring of clasped fingers. There was a tenderness in that joining, in the small physical fact of being linked, however briefly, to the people you were about to eat with. If you were a guest in a home where grace was said and it was not your own custom, you honoured it without hesitation. You bowed your head with the rest. You held a respectful stillness through the words, whatever your own beliefs, because you understood that you were in another family's home, partaking of another family's ways. Grace was the custom of the house, and a good guest honoured the customs of the house. This was understood, and it cost you nothing but a moment of quiet respect. And there was something in that moment that reached past belief. It was the pause itself, the deliberate stopping before the meal, the refusal to simply fall upon the food as though it were nothing. To pause and give thanks, whatever words you used or did not use, was to acknowledge that the meal before you was not a small thing. Someone had grown this food, and someone had spent hours over a hot stove turning it into what now steamed on the platters. The bounty of the table did not simply appear. That, perhaps, is what feels most absent from so many of our tables now. We're apt to sit down and begin at once, our attention already wandering elsewhere. The habit of the pause, the small ceremony of thanks has faded in many homes, and whatever one makes of the reasons, something quiet and good went out with it. For that brief bowed head moment gave the whole meal a weight it might otherwise have lacked. It said, before a single bite, that this gathering mattered, that the people around this table mattered to one another. It drew the scattered attention of a dozen guests into one shared breath, and made of them once more a company rather than a crowd. So you bow your head with the others as the hush comes down. You feel the warm hand of the guest beside you, if hands are joined, or fold your own quietly in your lap. The few familiar words are spoken, and then it is done. The heads lift, the talk begins to stir again, and the meal may truly start. But it starts now on a note of thanks, and that note lingers softly beneath the whole evening, an ordinary night made a little bit holy. Now you look at the small army of silverware arranged before you, and perhaps a flicker of worry passes through you. So many forks, so many spoons. But there was a simple secret every well-raised guest carried, and you carry it too. You work from the outside in. The fork farthest from the plate is for the first course, and you move inward with each new dish that arrives. The little spoon resting above your plate waits patiently for dessert. Once you knew the trick, the whole intimidating arrangement became a quiet map, guiding your hands gently from one course to the next. It could be a daunting sight to the uninitiated, that gleaming rank of silver laid out on either side of the plate. 2 forks, sometimes 3, a knife, its blade turned inward toward the plate as courtesy required, a soup spoon, round and deep. To someone who did not know the code, it might have seemed a test, a trap laid to catch out anyone who did not belong. But it was nothing of the kind. It was simply a map, and the map read the same at every proper table in the country. Work from the outside in. That was the whole of the secret, and it was as reliable as sunrise. The hostess had laid the silver in the order the courses would come. the outermost pieces first, the innermost last, so you had only to reach for whatever lay farthest from your plate, and you could not go wrong. When the soup arrived, the spoon at the far right was yours. When the first small course came, the fork at the far left was the one to lift. The little spoon above the plate held its own quiet promise. It sat apart from the rest, up beyond the rim, and it waited through the whole meal for the sweetest moment of all. That was the dessert utensil set out from the start, but not to be touched until the savoury dishes were cleared. Seeing it there through the meal was a small pleasure in itself, a promise kept in silver. There was reason behind every piece of it, and behind the placement too. The glasses stood above the knife to the right. The bread plate sat up to the left, with its own small butter knife. Everything had its spot fixed by long custom, so that any guest at any table knew at a glance where things stood. The very sameness of it was a kindness. Because the setting followed the same rules everywhere, you were never truly lost. And that, in the end, was the beauty of the thing. What looked like a test was really a courtesy, a system designed to put everyone at ease once they understood it. The rules were not there to trip you up, but to hold you up. A person who knew the code could sit down at the grandest table in the land and feel perfectly at home, because the code was the same as it was at his own mother's table, only with more pieces of silver laid out. We have simplified all of this away for the most part. A fork, a knife, a spoon if we're feeling formal, and that is the end of it. There is an ease in that. But something graceful was folded into the old array, some sense that a meal in courses was a small journey, each dish honoured with its own proper tool. For the well-raised guest, the whole business was second nature, learned so young it required no thought at all. Your hand simply went to the right piece, guided by a habit so deep it felt like instinct. And that ease was itself a kind of grace, a quiet confidence at the table that let you give your real attention to the food and the company. So you look at the gleaming rank of silver, and where a stranger might feel worry, you feel only calm. You know the secret. The intimidating array becomes, under your knowing eye, a simple and friendly map. And as the first course arrives and your hand goes surely to the outermost piece, you feel the quiet satisfaction of a person perfectly at home at the table. The food is before you now, steaming, fragrant, almost unbearably tempting. And still, you wait. No one begins until the hostess begins. You watch for her to raise her fork, that small signal that the meal may truly start, and only then do you touch your own. It took a certain patience sitting before a warm plate and holding perfectly still. But there was a reason woven into it, a way of honouring the one who had worked all day so that you might be fed. That small act of waiting turned eating into something shared, rather than something simply done. It was of all the table's small disciplines perhaps the hardest, and certainly the one that asked the most of a hungry guest. For there sat the food, at last, right before you. You had waited through the golden hour of drinks, through the drift to the table, through the napkin and the grace, and now the plate was set down and its warmth rose to your face, and every instinct in you said to begin, and still you did not. You folded your hands and you held yourself still, and you waited. You waited for her, the hostess, the woman who had made all this. Your eyes went to her, quietly, without any obvious staring, watching for the small motion that would free the whole table. Often the hostess ate last and began first, a strange double duty, serving everyone else before herself and yet holding the privilege of the first bite that told the table it might follow. The reason behind the waiting was not hard to find. It was, at bottom, an act of honour toward the one who had done the work. She had planned this meal, shopped for it, spent hours in a hot kitchen bringing it to the table. To fall upon the food the instant it landed without waiting for her would have been to treat all that labour as nothing. The waiting said the opposite. It said, "We will not begin without you. We honour what you have made." And there was a second grace in it, beyond the honouring of the hostess. The waiting made the meal a shared thing rather than a scattered one. Imagine a table where each person began the moment their own plate arrived, some already eating while others still sat before empty settings, the whole company out of step. The custom of waiting drew everyone into the same moment. When the hostess lifted her fork, a dozen forks lifted with her, and the meal began as one. It asked patience of a bodily kind that our own age has grown unused to. We are accustomed now to satisfying a hunger the instant we feel it, to eating when and where we please, often alone, often with half our attention elsewhere. But there was a real strength in that small discipline, and a real sweetness too. To master your own hunger for a moment, for the sake of courtesy and fellowship, was a little daily lesson in putting others before yourself. And how much better the food tasted perhaps for having been waited for. Anticipation is its own seasoning. The pause before the first bite only sharpened the pleasure when at last the fork was lifted. There is a wisdom in delay that our hurried age has half forgotten, that the thing waited for is savoured more deeply than the thing snatched at once. So you sit before your steaming plate, hands quiet, appetite stirring, and you master it gently for a moment longer. You keep your eyes soft on your hostess as she finally settles into her own chair and takes up her own fork. And when she lifts it, the whole company moves together at last, a dozen forks rising as one. The meal has begun the right way, all of you together, the hostess honoured and the fellowship whole. You take your first bite, and it is all the sweeter for the waiting. Soon the serving dishes begin their slow journey around the table. Here too there was an order to things. You pass to the right, always to the right, so the bowls and platters move together like planets in a gentle orbit. And when someone asked for the salt, you passed the pepper along with it. The two never parted, as though they were an old married couple who could not bear to travel alone. You served yourself a modest portion and sent the dish onward. It was a quiet dance of give and take, everyone mindful of the person seated beside them. The passing of the dishes was one of the table's loveliest small choreographies, a thing done 100 times over the course of a meal and yet done so smoothly it hardly registered as effort. The platters and bowls began their circuit. The roast, the potatoes, the beans, the rolls, each setting off round the table on its slow and steady way. And they all went the same direction, to the right, so that no two dishes ever collided head-on. Everything moved together in one gentle current, like the planets wheeling in their fixed courses. There was real sense in the rule, beyond mere custom. When everyone passed the same way, the dishes flowed without tangle or confusion, each one reaching every guest in turn. A dish sent the wrong way met the oncoming traffic and caused a small snarl. But sent to the right, always to the right, the whole table's bounty circulated as smoothly as water in a stream. And then there was the small and charming law of the salt and pepper, that they must always travel together. Ask for the salt, and the person nearest it would send the pepper too, the pair handed down side by side. It was a silly rule in a way, and everyone half knew it, and yet everyone kept it, out of habit and a kind of affection. There was a gentle humour in it, a bit of the table's own folklore. The serving of yourself was governed by its own quiet courtesy. You took a modest portion, always. To heap your plate high with the first dish that came your way was to forget the others still waiting down the line. You didn't know how many the dish was meant to serve, so you served yourself reasonably, with an eye to the whole table, and sent the dish onward. It was all, in the end, an exercise in mindfulness of the person beside you. To pass a heavy platter, you steadied it, you offered it. You made sure your neighbour had a firm hold before you let go. If a dish had a serving spoon, you left it in, handle turned outward, ready for the next hand. The whole slow circulation of the dishes was really a circulation of small kindnesses, each guest attending to the next. There is a warmth in that image that stays with you, the loaded platters making their patient rounds, hand to hand, neighbour to neighbour, the whole table joined in the shared work of feeding one another. To be fed at that table was to be fed in part by the person beside you, who steadied the dish and offered it and made sure you had your share. We've grown more casual about it now, plates often filled at the counter or dishes set out for each to grab as he pleases. And there is nothing wrong with ease, but something companionable went out of the meal when the slow passing round of the dishes faded, some sense of the table as a single body moving together. So the dishes begin their gentle orbit and you take your part in it without a thought. You pass to the right. You send the salt and pepper along together, that faithful old couple. You serve yourself modestly and steady the platter for your neighbour as you hand it on. And all around the table the same small courtesies go quietly round and round, the bounty circulating on a current of care until every plate is full and the whole company sits fed and content. Now, as you begin to eat, a lifetime of gentle training guides your hands. Elbows stayed off the table. You cut one small bite at a time rather than carving up your whole plate at once. You chewed with your lips closed and never spoke with your mouth full. You matched your pace to the table, neither racing ahead nor lagging behind. These were not cold, fussy rules, but small kindnesses, ways of making the meal pleasant for everyone. To eat well in company was to show that you had been raised with care, and everyone quietly noticed. The training had begun in childhood, at your own family's table, under the patient and unrelenting eye of your mother. Sit up straight, elbows off the table. Don't reach, ask. Chew with your mouth closed. Don't talk with food in your mouth. 1,000 small corrections, delivered again and again over the years, until they sank so deep they became a part of you. No longer rules you remembered, but simply the way you ate. And now, a grown guest at another's table, you carried all of that gentle instruction in your very hands, and it guided you without your having to think of it at all. The keeping of the elbows off the table was among the first and firmest of the laws. You sat upright, your forearms coming to the table's edge when needed, but your elbows never planted upon the cloth, never sprawling, never used as props for a slumping frame. It kept you neat and contained, gave you a certain poise, and left a room for the dishes and the passing hands. Between courses, or in a pause, your hands rested quietly in your lap or lightly at the table's edge. You cut your food one bite at a time, and this too was a small art. You did not fall upon your plate and saw the whole of your meat into pieces all at once, the way one might cut up food for a child. You cut a single bite, set down your knife or kept it lightly in hand as the style of the day allowed, and ate that bite before cutting the next. It was slower, yes, and that was rather the point. It kept the meal unhurried, kept your plate looking neat and civilized rather than like a battlefield, kept you from bolting your food. Eating one bite at a time was eating with attention, with grace, with a certain respect for the food and the occasion. The chewing and the talking were governed by the plainest courtesy of all. You chewed with your lips closed quietly, so that no one beside you was treated to the sight or sound of your working mouth. And you never, ever spoke with food in your mouth. If someone addressed you mid-bite, you finished, you swallowed, and only then did you answer, with a small nod meanwhile to show you had heard. These were not fine points of etiquette so much as basic decencies, the difference between eating like a civilized person and eating like a creature at a trough, and everyone at the table depended on everyone else to keep them. And then there was the matter of pace, subtle and important. You watched, without seeming to, how the table was eating, and you matched yourself to it. You did not race ahead and sit finished and idle, while everyone else was still halfway through their plates, which would make them feel rushed, watched, hurried along. Nor did you dawdle far behind, still eating long after the others had set down their forks, which would hold up the clearing of the course and make you the object of everyone's patient waiting. You kept pace with the company, an easy middle pace, so that the whole table moved through the meal together, beginning and finishing more or less as one. It is worth pausing on the true nature of all these rules, for they are easily mistaken. Seen coldly, they can look like fussiness, like arbitrary fastidiousness, like a way of judging and excluding those who did not know them. And no doubt they were sometimes used that way, for people are people in any age. But at their heart they were nothing of the kind. Every one of them was a small kindness aimed at the comfort of the others at the table. Closed-mouth chewing spared your neighbour an unpleasant sight. Matched pace spared the whole table the awkwardness of waiting. Neat cutting kept the meal a pleasant thing to look upon. The rules were not about you at all, really. They were about everyone else. That was the deep secret of table manners, the thing that gave them their grace. They were a way of thinking of others even in the most animal of acts, the taking of food. They took the simple, hungry business of eating and wrapped it in consideration, so that a meal in company became not a scramble of individual appetites, but a shared and civilized pleasure, everyone attending quietly to everyone else's comfort. To eat well in company was, at bottom, to be kind, and that kindness was noticed and felt, even when it was never spoken of. So you eat, and a lifetime of your mother's patient teaching moves through your hands and holds you gently to the mark, elbows off the cloth, one small bite at a time, lips closed, no talking through a mouthful, your pace matched easily to the table's own. You do not think about any of it. It is simply how you eat, how you were raised to eat, how everyone at this table was raised to eat. And the meal goes forward smoothly and pleasantly because of it, each guest wrapped in the quiet consideration of all the others. The simple act of eating made, through all these small unspoken kindnesses, into something gracious and warm and good. Between bites, there was something you were always sure to do. You praised the food. You told your hostess how wonderful the roast was, how you simply must have the recipe for that shimmering gelatin salad in the centre of the table, and you meant it, or you made a graceful show of meaning it, because so much love and labour had gone into every single dish. A compliment to the cook was never wasted breath. It was the warm return she had worked toward all day, and her face would soften with pleasure to hear it. You understood, as everyone at that table understood, just how much lay behind the meal you were eating. Your hostess had not conjured this dinner out of the air. She had planned it days ahead, turning over the menu in her mind, choosing dishes she hoped would please. She'd gone to the butcher and the grocer and carried the heavy bags home. She'd spent the better part of the day at the stove, in the heat and the steam, watching and stirring and timing everything so that it would all come to the table hot and ready at once. Every dish before you was hours of her life, given freely in the hope of your pleasure. To eat it in silence, to take it all as though it were nothing, would have been a quiet cruelty. And so you praised it, warmly and specifically. Not just a vague murmur that it was all very nice, but real, particular praise. The roast was cooked to perfection, so tender it fell apart at the fork. The gravy was the finest you had tasted in an age. The gelatin salad, that trembling jewelled creation at the centre of the table, was so lovely you hardly wanted to disturb it, and you simply must be given the recipe. You found the good in each dish, and you named it, out loud, so that your hostess could hear her labour recognised. The asking for a recipe was a compliment all its own, and one every cook understood and treasured. To ask for a recipe was to say, "This was so good that I want to make it myself, in my own kitchen, for my own family." There was no higher praise a dish could earn. A hostess whose gelatin mould or whose casserole or whose pie prompted a request for the recipe went to bed that night warm with quiet pride, and often enough she would write it out for you gladly, in her own hand, and a little of her passed along with it into your kitchen. Recipes travelled that way, table to table, friend to friend, a whole web of women's cooking spreading through a neighbourhood on the strength of sincere compliments. There was, it is true, a measure of ritual in the praising, a certain expectedness to it. Everyone knew the compliments would come, and the hostess would demur and protest that it was nothing, that she had thrown it together, that the roast had very nearly been overdone. She would deflect the praise even as she drank it in, because to accept it too readily would have seemed immodest. It was a small dance, the offering and the deflecting, and both parties knew the steps. But the ritual did not make the praise false. Beneath the expected words lay a real and warranted gratitude, and everyone felt it, and the dance itself was a pleasure, a way of honouring the cook that both could enjoy. For the compliment was, above all, the cook's true wages. She was not paid for her long day at the stove. She would receive no bonus, no promotion, no public recognition for the meal she had laboured over. Her only return, the only thing she worked toward through all those hot hours, was the pleasure of her guests and the warm words they spoke over her food. Those words were what she had earned, and a guest who withheld them, however good the food, robbed her of the one payment her labour was ever going to receive. A compliment to the cook was never wasted breath indeed. It was the whole point of the exercise, the warm return that made the long day worthwhile. You think of how easily we forget this now, how often a meal is eaten with barely a word about it. The cook's effort passing unremarked, the food consumed and the plates cleared and nothing said. It is not unkindness usually, only forgetfulness, a failure to notice the labour behind the meal, because the meal appeared as if by magic, hot and ready before us. But the old habit of praise was a better habit. It kept the cook's effort visible, honoured, rewarded. It made sure the hours at the stove did not vanish unthanked. It closed the circle, the giving of the meal answered by the giving of gratitude, so that both the feeding and the thanks flowed warm around the table. So between your bites, you're sure to speak. You catch your hostess's eye down the length of the candlelit table, and you tell her sincerely how wonderful the roast is, how you must have the recipe for that lovely salad. And you watch her face as the words land. Watch the small, pleased softening, the modest protest that it was nothing, the quiet pride she cannot quite hide. Her long hot day in the kitchen has found its answer at last, in the warm words of a grateful guest, and the whole table takes up the praise, and the cook is thanked as she deserves. It is such a simple thing, a kind word over a good dish, and yet it is the very heart of the meal, the return that makes all that loving labour worthwhile. As the plates empty a little, the talk begins to flow more freely, but even here you tread with grace. There were topics that belonged at the table and topics that did not. You spoke of pleasant things, of children and neighbours, of the coming holidays and the fine weather. You steered well clear of money, of illness, of anything that might sour the mood or start an argument, and you made sure to turn and speak with the guest on either side of you, so that no one sat in silence. Good conversation was a gift you gave the table, offered as generously as the food itself. The talk at the table was its own dish, in a way, as carefully prepared and as much a part of the evening's pleasure as anything the hostess had cooked. It flowed all through the meal, rising and falling, moving from one small subject to the next, and a good guest gave real thought to his part in it. For the conversation could make or break an evening. A table where the talk ran warm and easy and kind sent its guests home glowing. A table where the talk turned sour or awkward, or where some poor soul sat forgotten and silent, left a chill on the whole affair that no amount of good food could quite warm away. And so there were topics you embraced and topics you left firmly alone, and every well-raised guest knew the difference. You spoke of the pleasant sunlit things, these safe and happy subjects that could be shared by all. The children and how they were growing, the doings of the neighbourhood, the holidays coming up and the plans being laid for them, a film someone had seen, a book someone had read, the fine weather or the garden or the small good news of ordinary life. These were the topics that warmed a table, that everyone could join in, that carried no sting and no risk of quarrel. The topics you avoided were just as well known. Money was not spoken of, not what things cost, nor what anyone earned, nor how anyone's fortune stood. It was thought vulgar and likely to breed comparison and discomfort. Illness and unpleasantness were kept from the table, for who wished to hear of ailments and troubles while trying to enjoy a good roast? And above all, you steered wide of anything that might spark an argument, the hot and divisive subjects on which people held fierce opinions and were apt to fall out. A dinner table was no place for a quarrel. It was a place for warmth and ease, and a good guest guarded that warmth by keeping the talk on gentle ground. But avoiding the wrong topics was only half the craft. The greater half was the positive duty of drawing everyone in, of making sure that the conversation was a gift shared by the whole table, and not a pleasure hoarded by a few. Here lay one of the truest marks of a considerate guest, the care taken to turn and speak with the person on either side of you. You did not fix all your attention on one lively neighbour and leave the other to sit in silence. You divided yourself, turning first to one side and then to the other, drawing each into the talk, making sure that no one within your reach sat forgotten and alone. It was a special kindness to seek out the quiet one, the shy guest who did not push himself forward, the newcomer who knew no one, the person sitting a little outside the flow of the talk. To such a one you turned with the gentle question, an easy opening, a way into the conversation that asked nothing difficult and offered only welcome. You drew them out, patiently, warmly, until they found their footing and their voice. To leave a fellow guest stranded in silence while the rest of the table laughed and talked was among the small unkindnesses a good person simply would not commit. Everyone at the table was your charge, in a sense, everyone within your reach your responsibility to include. There was skill in it too, in the tending of the talk itself, much as there had been in the earlier hour of small talk over drinks. You listened as much as you spoke, perhaps more. You asked questions and attended to the answers. You did not hold forth at length on your own affairs, nor bore the table with a long tale that only you found interesting, nor talk over others or snatch the conversation to yourself. You kept the flow moving, generous and light, making room for every voice. Good conversation was a shared creation, built by everyone together, and your part was to add to it graciously and never to dominate it. We have grown, in some ways, less practiced at all this. We are quick now to reach for a screen when the talk lags, sometimes willing to let a hard or divisive subject sour the mood rather than steer gently away from it. And the old care for the silent guest, the deliberate turning to draw in the one left out, is a courtesy that has grown rarer than it should be. Something warm is lost when a table forgets these things, when the talk becomes a competition rather than a gift, when some sit forgotten while others hold the floor. So as the plate's empty and the talk flows freely, you tread through it all with grace. You keep to the pleasant sunlit subjects and leave the hard ones well alone. You turn first to the neighbour on your right, and then to the one on your left, drawing each in, and you seek out the quiet guest with a gentle question and make a place for him in the warmth. You listen more than you hold forth, and you keep the conversation moving light and generous around the whole table, and the talk grows warm and easy and kind, a gift given and received by everyone at once, as nourishing in its way as the good food on the plates, so that when at last the evening ends, the whole company will carry home not only a fine meal, but the deeper pleasure of having been, for a few warm hours, truly good company to one another. Perhaps somewhere in the house you can hear them, the soft clatter and giggle of the children. On a formal evening, the little ones were often fed earlier at their own table in the kitchen, before being brought out to say a polite good evening to the guests. And when children did join the grown-ups, they were expected to sit quietly, to speak only when spoken to, and to mind their manners closely. It shaped them, those long evenings of watching and waiting. They learned the customs of the table by living inside them, the very same way you once did. The children of the house had their own place in the evening, and it was a place carefully set a little apart. For a formal dinner, the little ones were most often fed first and fed separately, given their supper at the kitchen table, or an early sitting of their own, so that the grown-ups' evening could unfold without the demands and distractions that small children inevitably bring. It was not unkindness, this separation, but a recognition that a long-mannered dinner was no place for a restless toddler, and that both the children and the guests were happier for the arrangement. The little ones ate earlier, more simply, and then were readied for the appearance that came next. For appear they did at the proper moment, scrubbed and combed and dressed in their good clothes, brought in by their mother to greet the company. This was a small ceremony in itself, and the children knew their part. They came in and said their polite good evenings, shook hands or offered a shy curtsy, answered kindly the questions the guests put to them about school and their studies and how they were growing. They were shown off gently, a mother's quiet pride in her well-mannered children, and the guests exclaimed over how big they had gotten and how nicely they behaved. And then, their duty done, they were sent off to bed or back to their own quarters, and the grown-ups' evening resumed. When children were old enough and the occasion less formal, they might join the table with the adults, and then a stricter code took hold of them. They were to sit quietly, upright, minding their manners with a care even greater than the grown-ups showed, for a child's manners were always on display and always being judged gently by every adult present. And the old rule held firm above all others: Children were to speak only when spoken to. They did not interrupt. They did not clamour for attention or chatter through the grown-ups' talk. They sat and they listened, and they answered politely when addressed, and otherwise they held their peace. It sounds stern to our ears now, that old rule, and in some ways it was. We have come to value the voices of children more, to draw them into the conversation, to ask their opinions and delight in their chatter, and there is much that is good in that change. But it would be too easy to see only the sternness in the old way and miss what it gave. For those long, quiet evenings of sitting and watching and listening were, though the children scarcely knew it, a schooling of the finest kind. By being required to sit still at the grown-ups' table, to observe, to hold their manners, the children absorbed the whole gracious code of the table, not from lectures, but from living inside it, night after night, until it became a part of them. That was how you'd learned it yourself, after all, not from a book of rules, not from a single lesson, but from a childhood of sitting at that table, watching your parents and their guests, seeing how it was done, being corrected gently when you strayed and praised quietly when you got it right. The waiting for the hostess, the working of the silver from the outside in, the passing to the right, the closed-mouth chewing, the turning to speak with your neighbour, all of it you had breathed in as a child, sitting quiet and observant at the family table, until by the time you were grown it was simply how you were, no longer rules at all but instinct. The children in that kitchen, giggling over their early supper, were learning it just the same way now, and would carry it into their own grown lives as you carried yours. There is something poignant in that, the long chain of it, each generation learning the ways of the table by sitting quietly at the feet of the last, the customs passing down not through instruction but through simple presence, through years of watching and imitating and being gently shaped. The child who sat silent and observant at the dinner table in 1955 was being formed into the gracious adult guest he would one day become, and he would in his turn have children who sat and watched and learned from him. The table was a school, and the lessons it taught were the deepest kind, the kind that sink below thought and become character. So somewhere in the house you hear them, the soft clatter and giggle of the children at their early supper, and perhaps in a while they will be brought in, scrubbed and shy, to say their polite good evenings before being sent off to bed. And if any sit at the grown-ups' table, they sit quietly, minding their manners, speaking only when spoken to, watching everything with wide and absorbing eyes. They do not fully know it yet, but they are learning in these long patient evenings the whole gracious art of the table, the very same art you learned at just their age. The customs are passing down, quietly, from your generation to theirs, the way they have always passed. One more link forged tonight in the warm candlelight of an ordinary family dinner. The platters come around again, still heavy with food, and here lies a small test of grace. To accept a second helping was a compliment, a way of saying the meal was simply too good to leave behind. But you took only a little, and you never reached across the table for it, waiting instead to be offered or to have the dish passed your way. A thoughtful guest read the room, mindful of whether there was plenty to go around. There was an art to knowing when to say yes, and when to gently say you could not possibly thank you. The offering of seconds was, in most homes, a near certainty, for a good hostess always cooked more than enough and pressed her guests warmly to have more. She wanted her table to seem abundant, her guests to go home full and satisfied, and there was pride for her in a guest who ate heartily of her cooking. So the platters came round a second time, or she urged you from the head of the table to help yourself again, and here you faced a small and delicate decision, one that called for a nice reading of the moment. To accept a second helping was in the main a graceful thing to do, and often the kindest. It said plainly that you had enjoyed the food so much you wanted more, and there was no compliment a cook liked better. To refuse all seconds, to eat only your first modest plateful and then decline everything further, could even seem a touch cool, as though the food had not much pleased you. So the willing acceptance of a little more was a warm gesture, a way of honouring the meal and the woman who had made it, and a hostess's face brightened to see her guest reach happily for a second helping of her roast. But it had to be done with care, and here the art came in. You took only a little the second time, a modest addition, never a great new mound as though you were starting the meal afresh. And you never, ever reached across the table to serve yourself, stretching over your neighbour or lunging for a distant dish. You waited to be offered, or waited for the platter to be passed your way in the natural course of things, and then you helped yourself with restraint. To grab, to reach, to pile your plate high a second time would have undone all the grace of the gesture and marked you as a guest who thought only of his own appetite. Above all, the thoughtful guest read the room and read the platters before taking more. This was the heart of the matter. You looked quietly to see whether there was truly plenty, whether the dishes still stood heavy with food or were running low. If the roast was nearly gone and there were guests who had not yet had their fill, you did not take the last of it for a second helping, however much you might have liked to. You held back, you left it for others, you contented yourself with what you had eaten. A guest who took the last portion for himself while others still wanted, thinking only of his own pleasure, committed a small selfishness that a considerate person would never allow. And so there was an art, a real and subtle art, to knowing when to say yes and when to say no. When the platters were still full and the hostess pressed you warmly, yes was gracious and glad, a compliment to her cooking and a pleasure to you both. When the food was running short and others had needs unmet, no was the kinder answer, offered gently with a word of praise to soften it. You could not possibly, you would say, though it was all so delicious. You were quite full and quite content, and that too was a kind of compliment, the reluctant refusal, the sense that you would gladly have had more had you any room left. It called for a certain attentiveness, this whole small business of the second helping, an awareness that stretched beyond your own plate and your own appetite to take in the whole table, the state of the dishes, the needs of the other guests, the wishes of the hostess. And that attentiveness was, once more, the deep principle beneath so much of the table's grace, the constant quiet mindfulness of others, the habit of thinking always of the company and not only of oneself. Even in the simple matter of whether to have more roast, the good guest was thinking of everyone at the table, weighing his own wish against the needs of the rest. We have grown looser about all this now, apt to help ourselves freely to as much as we like, less watchful, perhaps, of whether there is enough to go round. And there is an ease in that, and often enough there is plenty and no harm done. But the old care was a fine thing, that habit of reading the table before reaching for more, of holding back so that others might have their share, of balancing one's own appetite against the good of the whole company. It kept the table generous and fair, and it kept every guest mindful of every other, right down to the last helping of potatoes. So the platters come round again, still heavy, and your hostess presses you warmly to have a little more. You glance, without seeming to, at the state of the dishes and the plates of your fellow guests, and you find there is plenty, and no one wanting. And so you accept, graciously, taking just a little, waiting for the dish to come to you rather than reaching, helping yourself with an easy restraint. Your hostess beams to see it, her cooking so enjoyed that you would have more, and you tell her again how very good it is. It is a small moment, the second helping, and yet the whole grace of the table lives inside it, that gentle art of pleasing your hostess and honouring the food, while never for an instant forgetting the others gathered round, all of you fed and content together in the warm and generous spirit of the evening. Look down at your plate now, and you understand something that was never spoken aloud. You were expected to finish what you had taken. To leave food behind was a small waste, and in the memory of a generation that had lived through lean and rationed years, waste was something felt deeply. So you served yourself wisely at the start, taking only what you knew you could eat, and then you saw it through to the very end. There was a quiet respect in an empty plate, a way of honouring both the cook and the harvest that had filled it. The clean plate was a matter of feeling more than of rule, and the feeling ran deep in the people gathered at that table. Most of the grown-ups there had lived through the hard years, the years of the Great Depression when food was scarce and every scrap was precious, and the years of the war that followed, when even those with money found the shelves bare and the ration book governing what a family could eat. Those years left a mark that never quite faded. To such people, food left uneaten on a plate was not a small thing. It was waste, and waste stirred something in them, a memory of want, a sense that to squander food was almost a kind of wrong. And so the empty plate carried a weight of meaning that a younger person, raised in plenty, might not have grasped. It was not that anyone would scold you outright for leaving food, not at a polite dinner among friends. But the disapproval, gentle and unspoken, hung in the air all the same. A plate left half full seemed to say that the food had not been worth finishing, or that you were careless of the bounty before you, and either message landed hard on people who remembered what it was to go without. The clean plate, by contrast, spoke a quiet respect, an acknowledgement that this food was a gift not to be treated lightly. The wisdom of it, of course, lay all in the beginning, in the serving of yourself. Because you knew you were expected to finish what you took with care. You served yourself a portion you were confident you could eat, no more, judging your own appetite honestly and leaving room, perhaps, for the second helping you might want later, or the dessert you knew was coming. A wise guest never heaped his plate with more than he could manage, for he knew he would have to see it through, and a mountain of food left half conquered was a small embarrassment as well as a waste. Restraint at the start made the clean plate at the end an easy thing. There was a lesson in it that reached beyond the table, a whole way of thinking about what one is given and what one owes in return. To take only what you needed, and then to use fully what you had taken, was a kind of quiet discipline, a respect for resources and for the labour and the fortune that had provided them. The people who kept the clean plate were people who did not take abundance for granted, who understood that the full table before them was not guaranteed, that it had been worked for and paid for and might in harder times not have been there at all. The empty plate was their small daily bow to that understanding, and it honoured the cook too, as so much of the table's grace did. Your hostess had laboured over every dish, and to eat all of what she'd given you was to tell her without a word that her labour had been worth it, that the food was good enough to finish to the last bite. A clean plate was a compliment as real as any spoken praise, a proof of enjoyment written in the empty china. To leave her food behind, however gently, carried the faint suggestion that it had fallen short, and no considerate guest wished to send that message to a woman who had spent her whole day at the stove. It is worth saying that this old habit, like some others, could be carried too far, could harden into a sternness that made children choke down food they truly could not manage, or left grown people uncomfortably overfull, rather than commit the sin of waste. Our own age has drawn back from some of that, has come to see that forcing down every last bite is not always wise or kind, that appetite has its natural limits and ought sometimes to be heeded. And there is sense in that softening, but something valuable lingers in the old feeling all the same, that food is precious, that waste is a small wrong, that what we're given ought to be used with respect and gratitude rather than carelessly cast aside. For in an age of such plenty as ours, where so much food is thrown away without a second thought, the old reverence for a clean plate can seem almost like wisdom recovered. Those who had known once understood something we're apt to forget in our abundance, that a full plate is a blessing and not a right, and that to finish what you are given is a way of honouring the whole long chain of labour and fortune that brought it to you, from the farmer in his field to the cook at her stove. So you look down at your plate, and you see it clean, or nearly so, the last of the good meal seen through to its end. You had served yourself wisely, taking only what you knew you could eat, and you had finished it all, and in the finishing you had honoured 100 things at once, the cook and her labour, the harvest and the hands that gathered it, the memory of leaner years, the simple truth that food is a gift. It was never spoken of, this quiet expectation, and it never needed to be. It lived in the people at that table like a deep and settled feeling, and the empty plate was its wordless expression, a small and humble grace offered up at the close of every meal. The meal winds toward its close, and there is one last small message you send without a single word. When you had eaten your fill, you laid your knife and fork together upon the plate, resting side by side to tell the hostess quietly that you were done. Left apart, they signalled that you were merely pausing. It was a silent language spoken all around the table, understood by everyone without a glance. Such small, wordless courtesies knit the whole evening together, and it is strange to think how much we once said to one another with the simple placing of a fork. It was a language written in silver, this quiet code of the utensils, and everyone at the table could read it fluently. Where you placed your knife and fork upon your plate said, without any need for words, exactly where you stood in the meal. Laid together, side by side, they announced that you had finished, that your plate might be cleared, that you wanted nothing more of this course. Left apart, the fork on one side and the knife on the other, or crossed loosely, they said the opposite, that you were only resting a moment, that you meant to return to your food, that the plate should be left where it was. This mattered a great deal in its quiet way, for it governed the whole rhythm of the clearing and the serving. Your hostess, or whoever tended the table, watched for these signals as she moved about, and she read them to know when a plate was ready to be taken away and when it must be left alone. Without such a code, she would have been forced to interrupt and ask, "Are you finished? May I take this?" breaking the flow of the talk and putting each guest on the spot. The silent language of the fork spared everyone that. A glance told her all she needed, and the plates came and went smoothly, at just the right moments, without a word spoken to disturb the ease of the table. And so you were careful with your placement, mindful of the message you were sending. If you set down your fork merely to reach for your glass, or to turn and speak with your neighbour, or to let a full mouth clear before the next bite, you left the utensils apart so that no one would whisk away a plate you had not finished with. Only when you were truly done, your appetite satisfied and your plate as empty as you meant it to be, did you bring the knife and fork together and lay them to rest side by side, the clear and final signal that this course was over for you? There was a certain restfulness in the completed gesture too, a small ceremony of ending. To lay your utensils down together at the close of a course was to set your tools aside, to fold your hands, to lean back a little and let the meal move on to whatever came next. It marked a small passage, a quiet full stop at the end of a sentence, and the placing of the fork had about it something almost satisfying. The tidy conclusion of one part of the evening before the next began. A meal moved through its courses in punctuated stages, and the resting fork was the punctuation. What strikes you most, looking back on it, is how much was communicated with how little. A whole language of readiness and completion, of pausing and finishing, conveyed entirely through the placement of two small pieces of silver, understood by everyone and requiring not a single spoken word. It was of a piece with so much of that gracious table, where meaning travelled in quiet signals and gentle customs, where a great deal was said through gesture and placement and the keeping of shared codes, and where the spoken word was reserved for the warmth of conversation rather than the mechanics of the meal. We've largely lost this particular language, and few today would know how to read a fork laid across a plate or think to send a message with one. Our meals are less formal, our courses fewer, our clearing more apt to happen all at once when everyone has plainly stopped eating. There is no great harm in the loss, perhaps, and the code was a small thing. But it was a graceful small thing, a bit of quiet cleverness that made the service of a meal run smooth and unbroken, and there is something to admire in a world that thought to devise it, that agreed upon it, that taught it to its children and kept it faithfully round every table. For it speaks, that vanished code, to the whole spirit of the thing, to a way of dining in which nothing was left to awkward chance, in which even the smallest matters were smoothed by shared understanding, in which consideration for others reached down into the very placing of one's utensils, to lay your fork so that your hostess need never ask, to signal your readiness or your pause without a word to break the talk, was one more of the countless small courtesies by which that table was made to run so gracefully, each guest attending to the comfort of the whole. So the meal winds toward its close, and you eat the last of what is on your plate, and then you send your one last silent message. You bring your knife and fork together side by side, and lay them to rest upon the plate, and the small gesture speaks for you. You are finished, satisfied, ready for whatever comes next. Your hostess reads it in a glance as she moves about the table, and in a little while your plate is quietly taken away. Not a word was needed. The fork said it all, and you marvel, just for a moment, at how much warmth and how much care could travel through so small and simple a thing as the placing of a fork upon a plate. Should you need to rise before the meal is through, there is a proper way even for that. You would not simply push back your chair and wander off. You caught the eye of your host or hostess and asked softly to be excused. Your napkin was laid loosely to the left of your plate, never balled up, never dropped upon the chair. Then you slipped away quietly, so as not to disturb the flow of the table. Even in leaving, you were mindful of the others, careful to keep the gentle rhythm of the evening unbroken. It happened, now and then, that a guest had to leave the table for a moment in the midst of the meal, and even this small departure had its own quiet grace. You did not simply stand, scrape back your chair, and stride off toward wherever you were going, leaving the table to wonder at your abrupt exit. That would have been a jarring thing, a small rudeness, a rupture in the smooth fabric of the evening. Instead, you left as you did everything else at that table, with consideration, with a mindfulness of the others, in a way designed to disturb the gathering as little as possible. First came the small courtesy of asking. You caught the eye of your host or your hostess quietly, and murmured your request to be excused. It need not be a grand announcement, need not draw the attention of the whole table or interrupt the talk. A soft word to your host, a brief and quiet, "If you will excuse me a moment," was enough. It acknowledged that you were leaving, that you did so with their leave, that you were not simply absenting yourself without a thought for the company you sat among. The asking was a small bow to the table, a recognition that you were part of a gathering and owed it the courtesy of a word before you stepped away. Then there was the matter of the napkin, and here again the old code held firm. You did not ball your napkin up and toss it down, nor leave it crumpled in a heap, nor, worst of all, drop it upon your chair. You laid it, loosely folded, to the left of your plate. This was the signal that you meant to return, that your absence was only temporary, that your place at the table was still yours and your meal not yet finished. The napkin to the left of the plate said, plainly, "I am coming back," and it told your hostess not to clear your setting, nor to think the meal for you was over. Only at the very end of the evening, upon leaving for good, would the napkin be laid down in its final way. A mere step away in the midst of things called for the loose fold to the left, and everyone understood the difference. And then you slipped away, quietly, gracefully, keeping your movements soft and your departure unobtrusive. You did not make a production of it. You rose without scraping your chair, you moved without hurry or noise, you did not call attention to yourself or interrupt whoever was speaking. The aim was to be gone and back again with as little disturbance to the table as could be managed, so that the talk flowed on unbroken, and the gentle rhythm of the evening carried forward undisturbed by your brief absence. A guest who could leave and return so smoothly that the table scarcely marked it, had mastered one of the finer small graces of dining. It is easy to see, in all of this, the same principle that ran beneath every rule of that gracious table, the constant mindfulness of others, the unwillingness to let one's own needs disrupt the comfort and the flow of the whole. Even so small and so private a matter as stepping away for a moment was governed by the thought of the company, shaped so as to spare them any jarring or awkwardness. You could not, of course, always avoid the need to rise, but you could rise in such a way that the rising cost the table nothing, and that was the whole of the art. There was dignity in it as well, a certain composure that the graceful exit lent to even the most ordinary necessity. To leave the table with a quiet word and a smooth step, the napkin laid just so, was to leave with poise, without fuss, without the small clumsiness of an abrupt departure, and to return the same way, sliding quietly back into your place, taking up your napkin again, rejoining the talk as though you had never gone, was to restore yourself to the table with the same easy grace. The whole small episode passed like a ripple on still water, barely marked, quickly smoothed away. We think little now of how we come and go from a table, apt to rise and leave with hardly a word, our napkins tossed down however they fall. And in the easy informality of most of our meals that is no great matter. But the old care had its quiet charm, that thought given even to so small a thing as stepping away, that determination to keep the evening's rhythm unbroken by one's own passing needs. It was consideration carried down to the smallest detail, courtesy woven so deep it governed even a moment's absence. So should you need to rise before the meal is through, you do it the proper way, the gracious way. You catch your host's eye and murmur softly, your request to be excused. You lay your napkin, loosely folded, to the left of your plate, the quiet sign that you will return, and you slip away without noise or fuss, moving gently, disturbing no one, so that the talk flows on and the table barely marks your going. In a little while you slip back just as quietly, take up your napkin once more, and rejoin the warmth as though you had never left. Even in the simple act of stepping away, you honoured the company you kept, mindful to the last of the gentle rhythm of the evening and of the others gathered in its glow. The plates are cleared now, carried off by your hostess, who waves away every offer of help, and the evening softens into its sweetest hour. Dessert appears, a pie still warm from the oven, a trembling gelatin mould, a plate of little cookies. Coffee is poured into small cups. Sometimes the party drifted back to the living room, the men gathering in one corner and the ladies in another, the talk growing easy and low. The urgency of the meal had passed, and what remained was pure company. It is that lingering, unhurried closeness that so many of us quietly miss now. There is a particular sweetness to this part of the evening, and everyone at the table felt it settle over them. The main work of the meal was done. The roast had been eaten and praised, the dishes passed and passed again, the plates cleared away, and now came the gentle downhill slope of the night, the part given over not to the business of eating but simply to the pleasure of being together. The tension of the formal dinner, such as it was, loosened its hold, shoulders eased, the talk grew warmer and looser. What remained was pure company, and it was the best part of all. The dessert was the last flourish of the hostess's art, and often the one she was proudest of. It appeared with a small fanfare, a pie still warm from the oven with its crust gone golden, a gelatin mould trembling and jewelled and catching the light, a plate of cookies she had baked the day before, a cake risen tall and frosted with care. The dessert spoon that had waited all evening above your plate came into its own at last, and the sweetness of it, coming at the end of the savoury meal, felt like a small reward, a treat earned, the loveliest note in the whole long composition of the dinner. The coffee came with it, poured hot and dark into small cups, and the two together, the sweet and the bitter, marked the shift into the evening's final and gentlest phase. There was no hurry now. You lingered over the coffee, sipping slowly, letting the warmth of it seep into you. The candles had burned lower. The room was hushed and golden. The great appetites of the meal were satisfied, and in their place came a mellow, contented ease, the particular happiness of people who have eaten well together and now want nothing more than to sit a while longer in one another's company. Often the party would rise and drift, then from the dining room back to the living room, or out onto a porch if the night was fine, seeking softer chairs and a more relaxed arrangement for the lingering hours. And here an old custom sometimes showed itself, the gentle parting of the company into men and women, the men gathering in one corner or one room, and the ladies in another. The men might talk of their work, of the world's affairs, of whatever men talked of among themselves. The women might draw together over their own subjects, their families and their homes and the news of their circle. It was a division we would find strange now, and have largely done away with, and there is good reason we have. But it was done then without much thought, an easy old habit, and within each little group the talk ran warm and free. Whatever the arrangement, the spirit of the hour was the same, and it was the spirit of unhurried closeness. The clock was forgotten. No one glanced at the time or thought of leaving just yet. There was coffee to be lingered over and talk to be enjoyed, and the simple, deep pleasure of being among people you were fond of, with nowhere else to be and nothing else to do but sit and talk and let the evening stretch out long and sweet around you. The urgency was gone. All that remained was the company, and the company was enough, was everything, was the whole point of the gathering finally arrived at. This, perhaps, is the part of such evenings that we miss most keenly now, though we may not always name it. Our own gatherings so often end the moment the meal is done, everyone rising at once, reaching for their coats, hurrying off to the next thing or home to their screens. We have half forgotten the art of lingering, of letting an evening ripen slowly toward its close, of sitting on over coffee long after the food is gone simply for the joy of the company. The lingering hour asks something of us that our hurried age finds hard to give, the willingness to let time pass slowly, unproductively, in the sole pursuit of one another's warmth. But how rich that willingness made the old evenings, and how much of their sweetness lived in that final unhurried hour. For it was there, over the dessert and the cooling coffee, in the soft-lit living room with the talk grown low and easy, that the truest fellowship of the evening was found. The formal shell of the dinner had cracked away, and what was left was simply friends and family and neighbours, sitting close and content in no hurry to part. That closeness was the real gift of the whole long evening, the thing all the ceremony and the courtesy had been building toward, and the lingering hour was where it finally bloomed. So the plates are cleared, and the dessert appears warm and sweet, and the coffee is poured into its small cups, and the party drifts at last into the soft-lit ease of the living room. The candles burn low. The talk runs warm and unhurried. There is nowhere anyone needs to be, and no reason to rise just yet, and the evening stretches out long and golden in the pure and simple pleasure of good company. It is the sweetest hour of all, this lingering close, and as you settle deeper into a soft chair with your coffee warm in your hands, you feel the deep contentment of it, and you understand why so many, looking back, remember these unhurried evenings as among the warmest hours of their lives. At last the evening draws to its gentle end. You did not overstay, reading the small signs that it was time, and you gathered your coat with warm thanks at the door. You told your hostess sincerely what a lovely evening it had been. But the courtesy did not end there on the porch. The very next day you would sit down with pen and paper and write a proper thank you note, a few heartfelt lines carried back to her by the mail. That small folded card was the perfect close to it all, a way of letting the warmth of the evening linger just a little longer. Knowing when to leave was itself a small art, and a considerate guest practised it with care. You did not linger on and on past the natural end of the evening, keeping your weary hosts up long after they had begun to flag, forcing them to stifle their yawns and wonder how to see you gently to the door. Nor did you bolt the moment the coffee was done, as though you could not wait to be gone. You read the signs, the subtle ones, a lull settling into the talk, a certain heaviness coming over the room, the hour growing late, and when you felt the evening reach its natural close, you rose, and you made your move to leave at just the right time, neither too soon nor too late. The leaving had its own warmth and its own small ceremony. You gathered your coat, retrieved now from the back bedroom where it lain all evening among the others. You spoke your thanks, sincere and particular, telling your hostess what a lovely evening it had been, how wonderful the dinner, how glad you were to have come. There were warm handshakes and clasped hands at the door, promises to see one another again soon, a last exchange of fond words on the porch in the cool night air. The welcome that had opened the evening was answered now by an equally warm farewell, the two of them bookends to a night of good company. And then you stepped out into the dark, and the door closed softly behind you, and the golden light of the house was gone, and the evening, it might seem, was over. But it was not quite. For a good guest knew that the courtesy did not end at the door, that one last duty, and the loveliest one, still remained. The very next day, or soon after, you sat down with pen and paper and wrote your hostess a proper thank you note. It was a small thing, that note, a few heartfelt lines on a folded card, but it carried real weight. You thanked her for the evening, warmly and specifically. You spoke of the fine dinner, perhaps named a dish you'd especially loved, recalled some pleasant moment of the night. You told her how much you had enjoyed her company and her table, and you sealed it and stamped it and carried it to the post, and in a day or two it arrived at her door, a small envelope with your familiar hand upon it, bringing the warmth of the evening back to her once more. Think of what that note meant to receive. Your hostess had laboured over the dinner, had welcomed you and fed you, and given you a warm and gracious evening, and now, days later, came this small written proof that it had all been worth while, that her guest had gone home happy and taken the trouble to say so. She would read it with pleasure, perhaps read it twice, perhaps keep it in a drawer with others like it. The note told her that her work had been seen and valued, that the evening had lived on in her guest's mind after he left her door. It was the final, lingering compliment, the warmth of the night carried gently forward into the days that followed. For that was the true beauty of the thank you note, that it let the evening linger, that it refused to let so fine a gathering simply end and be forgotten. The good feeling of the dinner did not stop at the porch. It travelled home with you, and it came back again in the note you wrote, and it reached your hostess once more days later, keeping the connection warm, extending the fellowship of one evening across the quiet spaces between meetings. In a world without the instant messages we send so carelessly now, that handwritten note was a real and deliberate act of care, a gift of time and thought, and it was treasured accordingly. We have nearly lost the habit, and we are the poorer for it. We say our thanks at the door now if we remember, and think that quite enough, and rarely sit down afterward to write out our gratitude by hand. The quick message we might dash off is not the same. It costs nothing and lingers not at all. But the old note, written slowly with a real pen on real paper, carried to the post and delivered days later, had a weight and a warmth that no hurried message can match. It was courtesy at its finest, gratitude given form, the warmth of an evening made to last. So the evening draws to its gentle end, and you read the signs, and you rise at the right moment to take your leave. You gather your coat, and you speak your warm and sincere thanks at the door, and there are clasped hands and fond farewells on the porch beneath the light. And then you step out into the night and go home, carrying the warmth of the evening with you. But you carry too the knowledge of one last small grace still to come, the note you will write tomorrow, the few heartfelt lines that will bring the warmth of this night back to your hostess once more. And so the evening does not truly end at all, not for a while yet, but lingers on gently, in the mail and in the memory, a fitting and lovely close to an evening built from first to last of nothing but care and courtesy and the simple human warmth of a table shared among friends. So here we are, at the end of the evening, and the good dishes are back behind their glass, and the candles have burned down to soft stubs. We walk through a whole night together, you and I. The invitation waited for on the calendar, The good clothes pressed and the shoes shined twice. The small gift carried carefully up the front walk, and the warm hand at the door, and the slow golden hour before anyone was called to the table. The napkin, the grace, the fork lifted and the fork laid down. The dishes passing hand to hand around a table where nobody was in a hurry to be anywhere else. None of it was grand. That is the thing worth remembering. It was just people being careful with one another, in the small ways, over an ordinary Friday supper. They did not think of their manners as a golden age of anything. They were simply trying to be kind, to make a guest feel welcome, to honour the woman who had spent all day at the stove. That care lived in the smallest gestures, and the smallest gestures were the whole of it. Maybe you carry one thing forward from tonight. Maybe you slow down a little at your own table. Maybe you wait for everyone before you begin. Maybe you write the note you've been meaning to write. Something small. Something that says, quietly, this evening mattered, and so do you. So as you settle in now, and your eyes grow heavy, let the warmth of that vanished table stay with you a while. There was such tenderness in the ordinary once. There still can be. Rest easy tonight. You're welcome here, and that has always been enough.